Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Um, we are holding a Cherif and Baba session in lieu of, well, not in lieu of the halaqah. We've discontinued the halaqahs until, I don't know until when, but we wanted to put something out to discuss what's going on and to create some kind of content to keep people engaged, to keep people thinking about what's happening in Palestine. And so there were some questions that I wanted to ask my father, and I thought might be a good discussion. And I think perhaps what can kind of set the stage of what I was thinking, because you haven't heard anything that I wanted to talk about yet, is that let me put it this way. So I when we used to live in California, I worked as a yoga teacher, and in the area where I worked as a yoga teacher, there were a lot of Israelis, actually a surprising amount. I remember I was working there, and there was one day where it dawned on me, I'm like, I've never actually interacted with so many Israelis at any time before in my life. And so, fast forward, we move here, and this, I started becoming very active on social media, as everyone should be right now. And the amount of arguments that I've gotten in with Zionists, these topics never really came up before. We were just doing yoga. But the amount of arguments that I've gotten in with Zionists over the last month is pretty astounding. Like, it kind of was, made me realize, okay, these were, they were Israelis, and we never talked about it before. And it's almost as if, it's not almost as if, because of everything that I know that the history that they believe in, the history that they're taught, is almost as if they're like living in an alternate dimension. And so it really highlighted for me how little people know about international law specifically. I think it's something that's so far out of the consciousness of the average American, and certainly I think it's more so for people who are in other countries. We don't think about it. And so I remember in Project Illumin, there were multiple points where you were trying to teach us about the historical context. This was 1,400 years ago. It was a very different human being. It was a very different society, was very different. And to understand the revelation, you have to understand the society that it was revealed in. And one of the things that you said across multiple halaqas was that the way of the world back then was completely different than the way of the world now. That the medieval world was one where there was no just live and let live. You were expanding or you were going to disappear. And that you had to understand that reality, because it was in the context, you saying this was in the context of questions that we got around the Islamic Empire, and where people are kind of insecure about our history, and saying you were answering it in that context. And you said but that era has ended, and now we're living in a new era. And you touched a little bit on international law, and I realize also that I probably know more than the average person because of proximity to you, but I know very little still. And so what I wanted to ask is now, because especially, I mean, after today's khutbah, that you said all of these institutions, all of these systems are a farce. Do you still agree with that those statements that you made in the halaqah, that we're actually living in a different era? Or do we still, I mean, because it seems to me that that's still what's happening. It's almost as if like have we just been in the delusion that we're in a different era, but still, and that's almost what's holding us back. But still, we are living in an era where people are constantly expanding.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. Um, okay, so, yeah, no, that's a good question. There are a number of things that we have to clarify, and um, the idea of permanent borders between states, um, borders that are surveyed, clearly drawn out, an official record exists of these borders between states, which a register which is kept in a centralized international body, which is the United Nations, is a fairly modern phenomena. And this is the idea of the modern nation state that is recognized as sovereign, and that every unit within its borders is recognized to be sovereign and to have rights within its borders, and to have the right to have its borders respected by everyone else. So that's a fairly modern idea. Now, but what brought us to the modern idea is that in the medieval era, before modernity, and so before we even come close to anything resembling an international order, there weren't borders, there were frontiers. So an empire would more or less know that this is where its frontier is, and it's sort of loose, and frontiers where empires and dynasties would expend a great deal of effort and resources in securing their frontiers and in making sure at least that their frontiers are not overrun, and so that they're not swallowed by a bigger political entity. So they're like fish in an ocean. But there is something that is very important to understand, that in the pre-modern world, population density was quite different. Technology was quite different, of course. The, the fact that the population density of the world was far less, the fact that the technology in the world did not allow for immediate communication and the immediate transmission of information, and the fact that people could not move from one part of the globe to another in a relatively short time, allowed for it allowed for space for this unregulated system of empires, dynasties with frontiers to exist with what you could call a semi-legal order. So there's no United Nations, there's no central body, but there are more or less rules that evolved between political entities. Rules like, for instance, that you shouldn't kill one, you shouldn't hurt the messengers that are sent from one sovereign to another. That if I am a sovereign and I send an envoy to another sovereign to convey a message, then that envoy should be able to have safe conduct until they come back. Rules like, different parts of the world recognized that they need exchange of commerce, and that in order to do commerce, you can't be violating each other's borders, all the frontiers all the time. So sovereigns would develop the practice of negotiating treaties with another sovereigns, and to say, okay, well, we in order to allow for silk trade, we promise that we're not going to mess around with each other's trade routes. Things like rules that emerged against pirates. Pirates were costing all political entities a lot, and causing a great deal of damage. So various heads of sovereigns would come together and would say, let's make a pact to fight off pirates and to try to clean the oceans of pirates to the extent possible. That was all manageable to a very large extent because the world did not have, and notice how much we didn't have. The world did not have passports and visas, because boundaries between sovereigns were porous. So it's quite possible for people to move from one political entity to another without, even a record of, not every human being carried an ID or were registered somewhere. There were a lot of human beings on the face of this earth that didn't carry IDs and weren't registered anywhere, and where in many ways they could melt, they could move from one place to another. They could pretend to be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, depends on their skills. Depends on also their linguistic abilities. Depends on maybe their look. And most important, yes, wars between polities could be very costly. So we all know that, for instance, the Mongol invasions, the Mongols didn't want to play by the rules. And the Mongols, were not really interested in trade. The Mongols were purely a fighting tribe. And because they were a fighting tribe, they decided we are going to invade as many polities as possible. And that's exactly what they did. They kept invading and invading and invading until they run out of steam and run out of resources. And when they ran out of steam and ran out of resources, what happened was they got absorbed by the cultures and societies that they conquered. Why was it possible to do that? Because the Mongols had no way of keeping record of who's part of the Mongols and who's not a part of the Mongols. They had no way of imposing a universal order. The most sophisticated the world had seen was the Roman Empire, but even the Roman Empire before the Islamic civilization was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, still there were an incredible amount They were strong in urban centers where you could say they imposed a certain order near the urban centers of the empire. But again, the more you got into the provinces, the further you got away, the less and less you would see of the Roman order. So why am I saying all of this? Is to emphasize a very critical point. The international order didn't have a centralized system like the UN, but because of where technology was, and because of the fact that we didn't burn fossil fuel, because of the fact we didn't have weapons of mass destruction that could not just destroy a people, but could literally obliterate life on Earth, because of the fact that not all of the Earth was occupied. There were plenty of parts of this globe that was not populated. Because all of that, it was a workable system. There was a very complicated, highly nuanced system of cooperation and conflict. Now, we enter into a phase, and this is the paradox of modern international law. All of this is more or less workable as long as all societies are more or less equal technologically. As long as we are fighting with swords and arrows and spears, the difference is a difference in strategy, a difference in discipline, maybe a difference in training, maybe a difference in the quality of steel that you are manufacturing. And that in itself acts as a system of balancing. It's like, nuclear deterrence between nations that have nuclear weapons. It's more or less they balance each other out. And so that provides for a certain system of equity, if you will, a certain system of balance, because no one has an absolute advantage. You are when you go to war, when you want to expand your territory, no one gets to fly planes and bomb the heck out of the other while you are safe in your airplane. No one gets to, fire off 1,000 missiles while you're sitting safely at home. You want to expand your territory, you're going to have to put your children at risk. You're going to have to go and invade using swords and spears, and your enemy is going to be also using more or less the same thing. And you're going to have to go, human to human, man to man, and that real cost is what, every once in a while you get people like the Mongols who simply didn't seem to share these reservations about human cost. And that's why they kept invading and invading and invading until they destroyed themselves. But more or less, the system of balance maintained indigeneity. In other words, people who are living in a society. And in fact, what was really remarkable about the medieval system is quite often those living on the land, they didn't care who ruled over them, because the rulers themselves, quite often all they cared about is that the farmer, the people who are building ships, the people who are doing iron work, the craftsmen, the whatever, is that they just pay their taxes. And as long as you pay their taxes, the state wasn't really interested in you. The state just pretty much left you alone, and once a year or once every 2 years, they come around and say, we have tax collectors, pay your tax. But other than that, so often indigenous cultures They would just sit around living their lives, and one ruler would come and another ruler would go, and it would make no difference to them. One dynasty would rule over them for 100 years, and then another dynasty would come and rule over them for another 100 years, and it would make very little difference. And so the part that where people seem to care is religion. That if Christian people, if they're ruled over by Muslims, they would notice, or Muslim people, if they're ruled over by Christians, they would notice. But even then, in the medieval world, we have numerous examples of people tolerating rulers over them of a different faith, because as long as they're left alone and they just pay their taxes and they live their life, just they manage their own life, they organize their own life, and so on. The big shift in our international order, in our world system, the big shift came with the technological breakthroughs that occurred largely in Europe. Technological breakthroughs and changes, radical changes in means of production that now changed the equation completely. It was no longer, swords fighting swords. It was someone shooting at a distance, a rifle, someone holding perhaps a spear or an arrow. And with that technological difference in the ability to produce weapons that made a decisive difference in the battlefield. I mean, when you look at the size of the French army that invaded Egypt, it was a relatively small army. When the French arrived in Egypt, the Muslim army in Egypt was so confident that they're going to be able to fight back the French. What made all the difference was cannons, because the French could stand there and fire these cannons, and for the mind of the indigenous cultures, these weapons were terrifying. For them there were no manliness, no chivalry. All the rules of the game have changed. The rules of chivalry where you go off and you show your bravery and your skill as a swordsman. All of that was suddenly just thrown to the side, and now it was these weapons that made Europe literally capable of conquering huge swathes of land with very little human cost. So the equation that we were talking about, where you're going to have to put on, you're going to have to pay the price of expansion, it was gone now. So they could conquer entire Africa, they could conquer entire Asia, they could conquer entire South America, and that added to the phenomena, to a new scientific phenomena or pseudoscience of eugenics, of believing that you have a society which now we can conquer the Africans and destroy cultures left and right. A very small, if 1,000 British soldiers can go and can fight 100,000 Africans and defeat them. And so what happens? Then you start going to pseudoscience. Darwinism was the thing that came in for an explanation as to why we are so successful and they are so unsuccessful. And with that started the mythology building up, the mythology of racism. Well, it is because we are superior. And it's not just we are superior in our scientific inventions or scientific discovery, we are superior in our way of life. Everything. From the way we dress, from the way we drink, from the way we sit, from the way we dance, from the way we do everything. We are just superior to everyone else. And that came mixed with also a European movement that it happened to be, and some believe that the church was holding as the control of the Catholic Church over Europe waned and weakened, that gave Europe a new taste of freedom, was creativity and being inventive and so on. And the reason I mention that is that Europeans, as they started conquering, and when I say Europeans here, I mean the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the British. These were the primary, the Prussians to a much lesser extent, the Russians in certain spheres. But as the technological revolution permeated European states, they, at the same time, on a very much racial basis, were very keen on not sharing the technological revolution with the people that they thought were inferior. And so darker skinned people. Now, mythology mixed with race. So, for instance, then they rediscovered the story of how God blessed the sons of Sam, the sons of Noah, alayhi salam, Noah. God blessed the progeny of Sam, but God cursed Ham, his other son. And then they said, well, look, it just so happens to be that the children of Ham are darker skinned and the children of Sam are lighter skinned. So, that makes perfect sense. That fit in with our racial or racist explanation of the universe that we live in. It also dovetailed with the fact that they found that they can, they conquered all of Africa, literally slaughtering any African tribe that stood before them. These African tribes have existed for centuries and centuries and centuries. Under the old system, under the old order, no one was interested in obliterating these. It made far more sense to negotiate with these African tribes, to trade with them, to keep them alive, and to keep the tribes no one was interested in micro ruling over the African tribes in the old system. So as long, they manage their affairs, and as long as they trade with you, as long as they work with your political interests and economic interests, life worked. But for Europeans, it was a completely different equation. They needed cheap labor. And Africans, the cursed descendants of Ham, the dark-skinned people, well, they're cursed. So, and they can make perfect, by enslaving them, they can do all the work that you need done to maintain this empire and to keep invading the world. And so what emerged, and this is the thing that what I call the paradox of modern international law. Where does modern international law come from? Well, modern international law didn't go back to the medieval system that basically acted on the assumption that, no one is out to to obliterate anyone else. The medieval system, which basically said, I might steal a little bit of the land of my neighbor. I might invade and take a little bit of their frontier land, but when all is said and done, I'm going to have to figure out a way to live with this neighbor because I can't destroy them and they can't destroy me. We are all more or less, we have the same technology, we're using the same weapons and so on. As the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and the British are now invading the entire world, everywhere, even places that used to be thought of as powerful and mystical and nearly invincible, like India. Now, the British found that they could march into India. No problem. No one had the power to stand and resist them. So what happened is that there emerged a whole group of, you don't just have armies invading and capitalists making money by enslaving people. You also have scholars that you are asking to explain the world to you. And so what these scholars basically started saying is, well, we are superior. We are, and here that word was invented. We are the civilized people of the world. We alone are the civilized people of the world. It just happens to be that the people who have this technology, who are invading the world, who are controlling the trade routes of the world, who are going to places like Africa, and although Africa is full of people saying, we've discovered this land for the first time. Well, how about all these people that are living there? Well, they don't count because they're not civilized. So think about it. South Africa was colonized. Australia was colonized. Australia was full of native people. New Zealand was colonized. It was full of native people. All of South America, who never spoke a word of Spanish or Portuguese, all of Brazil, Mexico, all of these lands were colonized, leave alone America itself. First the French, of course, the Spanish, and then the French, and then the British, and Canada was colonized, and the same pattern again and again and again. You come and you see people and you say, well, they don't count because they're not civilized. And so who does the law exist for? And people like Grotius and Vattel and Pfuffendorf, and there's a whole list of them, so-called the fathers of international law. They're actually known as the fathers of international law. Today, when you study international law, you're still taught that these are the fathers of international law. What they said is, there is a law for civilized people and a different law for uncivilized people. The law for civilized people says, you can't enslave, a French can't enslave a British. That's why, although the British and the French had many wars, they've never enslaved each other. Although the Spanish and British had many wars, they've never enslaved each other. Why? Because it is this new emerging system, quote unquote, of law, which said, well, the British should get along with the Spanish like they used to do in the old days. The French should get along with the British. The Spanish should get along with the French. Get along means they shouldn't trample over each other's possessions and over each other's properties. And there are rules. They shouldn't execute each other's prisoners of war, for instance. The fathers of international law, the genesis was the law for civilized people. But who were the civilized people? It was the white people. Excluded from international. That's why Napoleon, who prided himself on his treatment of prisoners of war, when he fought the British, when he fought the Prussians, when he fought the Russians, when he went to Egypt, he had no qualms about executing thousands and thousands of people as prisoners of war. Because to him, there is no law that applies to you. You're not civilized people. You're not like us. You don't look like us. And that law for civilized people is the beginning of international law. So, make a long story short, because it's already long, from the 1930s up to the very, very bruising experience of World War I, to the even more bruising experience of World War II. But remember that who fought in World War I and who fought in World War II? It's the civilized, quote-unquote, nations of the world. But you still saw some of this racism and this system when the US, for instance, drops nuclear weapons on Japan. But it didn't drop nuclear weapons on Germans. Because for the US, whether they recognize it or not, Japanese we're not as human. They're different. They're not like us. But nevertheless, the experience among the quote-unquote civilized nations of the world was so brutal, so bruising, so ugly. What the so-called civilized people of the world could do to one another was so shocking. And the cost of maintaining the mythology of the civilized world taking care of the uncivilized world, of civilizing the rest, had become burdensome. It had become, the war has sacked the resources of Britain and France, and Spain went through a civil war, and Portugal, and the Italians. And so they simply didn't have the money anymore to go spend to make, to show their goodwill in the countries they occupied, or to, so, and so what emerged and what solidified, it started before World War II, but it started with the beginning of the 20th century, really, that, what we're going to do is, let's forget the age of empire. Let's now have nation states, and let's have a very simple doctrine of equal sovereignty. It's very simple. You agree to be a member of the UN, you have the same rights and the same duties like everyone else in the world. And the idea, right after World War II, in 1945, is that we're going to have nation states, we're going to have fixed boundaries, everyone is going to know what their boundary is. And we are going to prohibit aggression. No more invasions, no more trying to play around with boundaries. Not only that, we are going to prohibit the use of force. In exchange, so we're going to say you can't use force to settle disputes anymore, and we're not just going to, because we're not just going to apply that as to the quote-unquote civilized nations and one another, but we're going to extend this. No use of force between any nation towards any other nation. And we are all equally sovereign. We all have the equal rights. The one thing where you see traces of the old system, and very significant traces, not small traces, is that those same traditional old powers, with the exception of adding China, which was quite significant, because Chinese were ethnically, it's racially different. But China, Britain, France, Russia, and the US, these 5 countries, they've excluded Italy to punish Italy because they lost the war. They excluded Germany. They excluded Spain because Spain had experienced a fascist government and a civil war. So these particular 5 states made themselves the permanent members of the Security Council. And the UN, the United Nations Charter, specifically says the countries have the inherent right to defend themselves. However, wars of aggression are prohibited. All countries must refrain from using force against one another. And if there occurs any conflict, the body that has the primary duty of maintaining peace and security in this world is the Security Council. So you go to the Security Council where you have the 5 permanent members, the old civilized nations, Britain, France, Russia, and so on, and the US, of course. And the part where our system showed this paradox still is that, however, if one of these nations doesn't agree, you can't pass something through the Security Council. That's the veto power. And so the system they came up with is, okay, we are all equal sovereigns, but except for one part. In the Security Council, you're not going to be able to pass something if one of the permanent members, the old, quote-unquote, colonial civilized powers, doesn't agree with it. Then it's not going to pass. I mean, in order for something to pass through the Security Council, it has to be okay with the superpowers. So where do you end up with this? There was an implicit promise in World War II, in order for this system to work, in order for this entire system to work, was France was saying, Britain was saying, the US was saying, Italy was saying, Spain was saying, for every single one of these old powers, we understand that we colonized a lot of the world. We understand that we colonized Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Britain had territories even at the coast of South America still. We understand we colonized Canada. We understand that we did all of that. But we're going to turn on a new page. A page where there are no empires, no imperial wars, no colonial wars. And what we are asking you, nations of the past, as now you are, developing your own technologies like China did, or, as you are trying to catch up in the technological race. And there was an anxiety among these old colonial powers as to the countries that they were liberating, the countries they were withdrawing from. Like, for instance, is India going to be able to catch up? And what if India catches up and becomes a superpower in its own might? Is it going to want revenge? Is Egypt, at that time, there was a question, is Egypt going to catch up? And if they catch up, are they going to want revenge? Is Nigeria going to catch up? And there were all these questions. So what they did is they basically said, okay, the past is past. Let's forget the past. No more colonialism. No more imperialism. And as proof of our good faith that we really mean that we are opening a new page of equal rights, is we're going to pass something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant for Economic and Cultural Rights. And what these instruments, what these treaties, and the Universal Declaration is a declaration, it's not a treaty, but anyway, that we are enshrining our guarantees. We are guaranteeing this new age in which we will, the bad old days are gone, and that you, if you are still colonized, you have the right to national liberation. You have the right to your freedom, to obtain your freedom, even so, although we prohibited the use of force, we are allowing the use of force in one condition, and that's in wars of national liberation. And that's what helped sell the entire thing. African countries, South American countries, Asian countries said, wow, so you are willing to go as far as saying that you are prohibiting the use of force even for you. You are saying the US will not use force anymore. Britain will not use force anymore. France will not use force anymore. But you are allowing us to use force to obtain our freedom in wars of national from those who colonized us. Yes, that's undeniable in international law. So when I said that it all turned out to be a mirage, for decades, we saw the promise not to use force to be just a lie. What the US did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the promise that colonized people have the right to national liberation and even the right to use force to obtain their liberty turned out to be a lie. Because the same countries, Britain, France, the US, made sure to defeat every movement of national liberation around the world and to do everything possible to suffocate these movements and kill them off. But then on top of that, the straw that so many people who wanted to believe in international law continued holding onto is what is known as human rights and humanitarian standards. Okay. So, you didn't really deliver on your promise not to use force. You really didn't deliver on your promise to use the Security Council to maintain peace and security instead of to steal the resources of other countries and to dominate other countries. Okay, fine. You didn't support movements of national liberation, and you continue to look the other way as we had Rhodesia and South Africa and apartheid and so many different situations and examples. But at least what we all continue to believe in is something called the Geneva Conventions that regulates brutality in the conduct of war. That at least the West continued to talk the language of human rights and civil rights and human dignity and so on and so forth. And what the war in Gaza revealed, it's like as if we turned back to a page from Vittoria and Pfuffendorf and Grotius, which said, there is a law for civilized people, but that law doesn't apply to uncivilized people. Because when you see everything the US and Europe have done, and the entire way that Israel thinks is exactly as if a page from the way that colonial powers treated indigenous cultures. If you dare slap me, I will obliterate you. That's the way they dealt with indigenous cultures. When the French entered Egypt, it is a well-known incident in which an Egyptian peasant, a French soldier, sexually harassed his wife. So he slapped that soldier on the face. He was sentenced to death. And the French officers, who we still have their opinion, the court decision, they said it is the most natural thing because a native should know that the punishment for daring to slap a Frenchman, of course, has to be death. That same logic was applied again and again to the American Indians. I mean, one faction of American Indians would commit some atrocity against a group of white people here or there. The punishment is that you destroy an entire tribe. So suddenly, you wake up and you realize nothing has changed. The same racism, the same elitism, the same language about, the lies. We all grew up, even I didn't grow up in the United States, but even back in the Middle East, I grew up, I was taught through American media, movies and so on, that the Native Americans are barbarians, savages, because that is how they're always portrayed. And they always want to rape white women. They always want to abduct white women. They always want to scalp white men. They're always just savages. Exactly the way Israel talks about Palestinians. And what is even worse, what makes Palestine particularly hurtful, is that at the time, when was Palestine colonized by Israel? 1948. 1948 is the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was issued. So as the West was telling the entire world, you have a right to freedom, dignity, equality. You have the evils of the World War II taught us that you have the right to resist colonialism and to national liberation, even the use of force, except you Palestinians. Why? Because we white people, we slaughtered and oppressed and persecuted Jews in our countries. We've committed the Holocaust. And guess what? You have to pay for it. Because that's always the equation with subordinated people, is that subordinator always expects the subordinator to pay the price for the well-being of the subordinator. Whenever, this is the dynamic of racism and colonialism, if you go back as long as you want, you'll find whenever things go bad, you look to the dark-skinned people and say it's their fault. Whenever things are not working for you, it's their fault. And you make them pay the price. Although sometimes it's very obvious that they have nothing to do with it, but it doesn't matter. That has always been the dynamic of racism. So it is just, Europe and the US and all of these quote-unquote civilized countries kept telling us, we draw the line at genocide. You know what? There are certain things called jus cogens, a fancy Latin name. Jus cogens are preemptory norms of international law. What does that mean? There are things that are so wrong, so bad, that there is zero tolerance policy. You will find us white people, at the forefront of standing up against those things. And there is no way we will allow these things to happen again. What are these things? Well, things like slavery, okay? Well, things like apartheid. Well, things like genocide. Other people, not us, white people, civilized people, can commit genocide, like bad China or the bad Burma. But we will never commit genocide, or will never even tolerate genocide. And so the big crisis was what? The genocide in Bosnia. Europe kept tolerating it until, under a different administration, the United States realized that not just the US, but US and Europe, all the white civilization, if you will, is going to lose face, because you kept saying since World War II, never again to slavery, never again to apartheid, never again to genocide. And here it's happening right in your midst, and you're not. So finally, Clinton takes the decision to go and bomb the Serbs and stop the genocide. But what Europe looked like, because the thing, it was elusive, because these were white-skinned Muslims, the Bosnians. So, a lot of people then chose very complex interpretations. Well, this was more like an internal civil war in Europe. Well, there were deep-seated historical reasons, cultural reasons. In other words, they tried to choose any interpretation but race and religion. But it came to Palestine, where you have clearly and undeniably an apartheid system in Palestine. Israel's have clear laws that make Jews superior to non-Jewish citizens in Israel, without a shadow of a doubt. An apartheid system that even organizations that resisted that conclusion for many, many years, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, finally had to say, yeah, it is an apartheid system. We can't deny it anymore. But then, so it's not just apartheid, not just racism, but not just colonialism, not just settler colonialism, but on top of all of that, it's full-scale genocide. And it's not that Europe is just looking the other way. Now, the same countries are actually enabling and empowering the genocide, because the genocide would not be possible but for all the weapons that are given, Israel is given open access to. It is like, someone who beats their wife and you give them an open tab in the bar. You can drink as much as you want. I won't charge you. And you know that they get drunk and they go home and they beat the heck out of their wife. Of course you're complicit. You basically said, drink as much as you want in my bar. You don't even have to worry about the cost. That's what Europe has done, and even more, because Europe and the United States have said, yeah, as whatever weapons you want. We won't ask questions. That's where. And that's why, it is a serious crisis. And I think it requires, I don't know if international law can survive this. The only way it can survive this is by continuing artificially to put international law on artificial respirators. How? By maintaining in power these corrupt dictators who rule the former colonized world, the dark-skinned world, the south of the world, not for the benefit of their own people, but for the benefit of their colonizers. Like the rulers of Saudi and the rulers of Egypt and the rulers, they may speak the same language, but where the rules as to how they think about national interests, about how they think about the world, how they understand the world, it's far more like a traditional old colonial agent. The way that when a governor appointed by Britain would deal with the British masters and the indigenous population or the native population that he governs over, or a governor, appointed by France. These rulers, the so-called Muslim rulers, that's precisely the way they act. If you study their policies and compare them to the way in the 18th century or the 19th century, these regional governors, these local, people who are dark skinned, but their masters are the colonial powers. That's precisely the way they would act. They would express regret when the British would massacre, there's a very famous massacre in Africa called the Koboko massacre, where it was actually French. The French massacred about 300 scholars of Islamic law in half an hour. They invited them to come meet with the French provisional governor, and when they showed up, they just massacred all of them. And that was the provincial ruler of the region. The Muslim governor over the region, who the French didn't inform that they intended to massacre, expressed his deep regret for the massacre and said it's really unfortunate and really regrettable, and prayed for a more peaceful day and better times, and that was it. Exactly like Muslim rulers do. No difference. So yeah.
Wow. That, I think I'm speechless. Honestly, that was amazing. And that answered so many questions that I had. And even beyond that put everything in perspective. And quite frankly, I think that it's something that a lot of us understand parts of it, but really don't because you can tell, in a lot of Islamic centers, a lot of Islamic organizations, and even not Islamic, but in the U.S., it's very common to think that, well, this is a local issue, or this is a state issue, or this is a federal issue, or this, we don't want to become political. But what's really stands out to me is that our complicity with all of this is much larger than just our tax dollars. Because if we are a member of the Security Council, if we have that much ability, and we're constantly gaslighting the world and constantly having it really makes sense of why there is so much money from Israel, from the U.S., whether it was the Iraq war or whatever engagement it's been, to make it seem like it's self-defense. That becomes like the narrative instantly.
Yeah.
It needs to be self-defense. And I remember even when I was younger, before I could, because I was in 7th grade when 9/11 happened. And I remember, because I didn't know anything about anything, but I distinctly remember that I felt like, I would have a lot more respect for you, the U.S. government, army, if you just did what you're doing, but were truthful about it. If you, it's like you I don't understand how 9/11 is connected to invading Afghanistan. I don't know. And then the Iraq war, and but it just.
I mean, let me put it, put it this way. This is what people don't really, because, after World War II, when the U.S., because the U.S. played a prominent role in getting the United Nations system created. Why? Because at the time, the United States knew that France and Britain and the old colonial powers, Spain, Italy, Portugal, the United States knew that they were all bankrupt after World War II, and they needed American help. But so at the time when the United States was watching them at the end of World War II, closing up their military bases, Britain had military bases all around the world. It was the biggest empire ever. So the United States watched them as the United States sponsored these principles. No to imperialism, no to colonialism, all the things we talk about, right? So in the 50s and 60s, the United States has a few military bases outside the US, but nothing coming close to a global presence. In the Muslim world, the United States, Britain still had some military involvement in certain areas like Saudi and Oman, but not in most of the Middle East. And the United States is still wanting to sell the world on this new world order in which everyone, has the right to sovereignty, to independence, and so on. Well, under the excuse of self-defense, which after all, the only use of force permitted under the UN Charter is self-defense and use of force in order to liberate yourself from colonial domination. Well, the US is not going to claim that, but self-defense. But under the excuse of self-defense, look at a map of the modern Middle East. The United States has at least one military base nearly in every Middle Eastern country. So the invasion of Iraq, where the United States kept saying weapons of mass destruction and we must defend our country, defend Iraq, no one ever claimed that Iraq was involved with 9/11, not even the Americans. And weapons of mass destruction posed a danger to what? To the U.S.? What chemical weapons or that you were claiming, and we all know. A danger to Israel. Have the Iraqis ever shot any chemical warhead on Israel? Well, but we are sure they have these weapons, and we must go in to protect our ally Israel. But under the cover of the war on terror and under the cover of the self-defending or defending self-defense, U.S. has military bases in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, in Egypt, in Morocco. I mean, literally, you look at a map and you say to yourself, how is this not occupied territory? The U.S., when the Iraqis, when the Trump assassinated that Iranian general, I forgot his name, the Iraqis were really upset. And there were mass demonstrations in Iraq. And of course, the U.S. does what it always does and said these are just the Shia, to always pit the Shia against the Sunnah. But the reality, it wasn't just the Shia. It was the Iraqis were upset because you killed someone on their land. And the Iraqis were demanding that the U.S. close down their military bases and leave. Again, another moment that is very revealing. Iraq said to the U.S., okay, we're thinking of actually telling you to leave. Close down your military bases and leave. The U.S. did something which is extremely revealing. told Iraq, if you tell us to leave your land, we are going to destroy your currency. Because what a lot of people do not know is since the invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi currency is entirely dependent on the US dollars. Why? Because the US made it part of the rules that Iraq has to deposit all its foreign reserves in the United States and has to do all of its oil business through American banks. So if the executive issues an order to New York banks, freeze Iraqi assets, don't let the Iraqi oil contracts go through, the Iraqi currency will flatten overnight, will become worthless. People will need to carry bags of cash to buy a loaf of bread. So, of course, what did Iraq do? It kept its mouth shut. How is that not colonialism? How is that? People cannot be liberated unless they first learn. I'm very impressed by Noura Eraiqat. Why am I very impressed by her? Because she is an intellectual force who is appearing on the international scene and forcing people to deal with the very difficult questions that she raises. But the reason that Noura Eraiqat is who she is because she's educated. You read her book, it's a highly educated book. So as long as Muslims remain oblivious and ignorant, we will never move a step forward because there is not even the opportunity for Muslim minds to wrestle with the problem. Because if you don't know it's a problem, you're not going to even think about it. So, anyone that contributes to the delusion, to the lie, is part of the system of oppression that keeps Muslims where they are. And that's the new paradigm that we must all adopt. It's like every imam, every teacher, every sheikh, every person, are you part of the delusion or part of the liberation? Because if you're not liberating me, if you're not making me wake up to the truth and the reality around me, then you are just part of my oppressors. And maybe in my lifetime, I'm not going to be able to do anything. Maybe. But at least if I know I have the option of educating friends, neighbors, children, and maybe in due time, they will have the opportunity to do something. But as long as the reason Muslims are in the horrible state they're in is because we willfully self-impose a system of ignorance to make life more palatable and more, make our life more acceptable. So what we said, let's be doctors, let's be engineers, let's make money. That will make our life good. Well, no, it hasn't.
Yeah.
If you're Iraqi, look at where your country is. If you're Egyptian, look at where your country is. If you're a Muslim, look at where the holy sites are. If you're Palestinian, look at where things are. There is no good came out of that willful ignorance that we're in. And that's what, in my entire life, I have been struggling time and time and time again to try to get out. But, subhanAllah, a lot of times, and this again shows you, the information that you get out is often as good as the question that you get. I mean, subhanallah, because like I think like yeah, all of this I've known for years, but just because no one has ever asked me the right question, because I know the feeling when you get the right question, and it's like as if someone came and lifted a weight off your chest. It's like, oh, finally, I can I can release. Subhanallah. I mean, but this is also a part of what Allah, that is why Allah teaches us through questions throughout the Quran.
Yeah. I mean, I think the mask is definitely off now more than it's ever been. You know, I'm first and foremost a byproduct of the American educational system. And the stories that we were, taught and raised with were that the U.S. is the great defender,
Of freedom.
and the defender of freedom, and the defender of the world, and the defender of democracy, and whatever it is, but it's always, and even if we acknowledge the hardships, it was always, whether it was the Native Americans or the or African Americans or um, the, the Afghanistan was a response to 9/11. Iraq was a response to the weapons of mass destruction. There was always a reason for that aggression, and I feel like this is just such. I mean, not to make it. This is such an interesting point in history because things feel very different. Even, I mean, for instance, since October 7th, and I remember you pointing this out. I don't remember if it was last week's khutbah or maybe it was a conversation that was off air. But you pointed out that all of the majority of the movements for Palestine are secular, and not Muslims. And I have it, the only one that I've seen is Omar Suleiman,
Who's speaking
with
on this, yeah.
Yaqeen Institute. MPAC has been speaking about it. CARE, obviously, but even the MPAC and CARE, they're like political organizations. But when I look at mosques, or even this one group called Rumi Center, which they're like Sufi, and it really has. I don't think ever before has the difference between the Islam that I follow and the Islam that they follow been more dramatic.
Yeah.
Because what they're as this is going on, they're talking about studying medieval texts, studying Al-Ghazali, that the purifying the soul and understanding the self, and we're gonna have a workshop to go through this medieval text and understand how do we make it applicable today. I don't like because I'm in psychology. It's actually like very much the same question to me. How insane is it to be worrying about the self? I don't even know what that is. Like there's some weird road inside of me that I can go through a mystical journey and arrive at it, that is somehow, and I believe that does exist, but the point is that it is somehow divorced or separate from the external reality. That there is a separation from the internal and the external. And so I think, it has made the delusion that we have all existed in for so long actually seem insane.
Yeah.
Whereas before, like, I felt gaslit, and felt like, constantly questioning myself, am I like a crazy, maybe people aren't as people have this figured out. Maybe they see something I don't. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Now actually it's like the mask is off, and it's so clear that that's insane. It's like you're in a burning building and you're talking about repainting the walls. I want to beautify my house when the house is burning down. And it's like, no, you need to jump through a window. You need to get out of the house. And I think that that's the situation that we're in. And I mean, maybe the house is already burned down. But, I mean, I came into this conversation wanting to ask questions about international law. And I don't feel embarrassed to say at all that through what you answered, it made me realize I don't understand anything at all. And to me, as someone who was brought up in the American educational system, with how influential the U.S. is, the picture that you really have drawn for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. is above international law. Maybe other people, other nations aren't.
The U.S. The funny thing is that the U.S. is subject to the international law whenever it suits the U.S. So whenever the law applies to you, whenever you want it to apply to you, that means you're not applied. You're not subject to the law. The whole point of this new world order was that we're all, and that's the first thing. I mean, and this is one of the things that struck me. There used to be a Russian channel that broadcasted in English that was available. Is it called RT? Yeah, RT. And, yeah, the Russian channel spread propaganda all the time. But the propaganda about Ukraine was clear if you are a moderately intelligent person. But what the U.S. did, which really tells you whether we really believe in the liberal democratic principle we espouse, is they banned that Russian channel. And the reason that they banned the Russian channel is because Russia, through that channel and through every venue that they had, they kept drilling again and again that the excuse that they kept citing every time they defended what they did in Ukraine or what they did in Crimea is by reminding the U.S. of what the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan and many other, and they had a list of examples. I mean, they would talk about Kosovo and they would get very specific. Like, you then did this and you did this and you used this logic. And the U.S., the honest truth is that the U.S. had no response because American diplomats know that the logic they instituted in this world basically says if you're strong enough, it's like, the old system of frontier, medieval system. If you're strong enough and you can get away with it, do it. That's exactly the logic that Israel uses. That's why whenever you listen to Israeli media, every time they talk about, well, look at what the United States did with the Native Americans. Look what the United States did with Iraq. Look what, in other words, people follow precedents. People are not stupid. So what did the U.S. do? It just banned the channel. You can't get that Russian channel now. Now, under what logic, what rationale in a democratic state do you have the right to say, we decide paternalistically that our people should not listen to, and by the same vein, there used to be a Hezbollah channel called Al Manar. Europe banned it, the US banned it. So you are, even in this technological, still the idea of we avoid the hard questions by deception and by suppression, and then we turn around and it's exactly like Israelis as they implemented a thoroughly supremacist system vis-a-vis Palestinians. What's the thing that Israeli Islamophobes kept accusing Muslims of? Being supremacists. It's like, and this is, by the way, again, a very old trick in colonialism and in dominating over indigenous cultures. Whatever weakness is within, you point at the other and accuse the very victim, and you accuse the victim of. And because, this is, Machiavelli writes about this in his book, The Prince, where he says, basically, it's the best defense in the world. Don't wait. If you assault someone, and he tells the prince, if you take people and execute them, don't wait around till people come and accuse you of having executed their kin. You preemptively go to these people and accuse them of having attacked you and assaulted you and assaulted your soldiers. Because the best defense is an attack. And it is amazing that people just can't see over these, the simplest, most basic. You see it in a movie and you sort of, people shake their head and say, yeah, we know that. It makes perfect sense. But then you come to real life and they can't see it. The other thing, I just want to comment about, the danger and the reason I suspended the halaqas on الحكم الاسكندرية
العطائية.
العطائية الحكم العطائية صح. ابن عطاء السكندري. So the reason I stopped it is that there is always a danger, especially in when Marx said that religion is the opiate of the people, this is precisely the phenomena. And subhanAllah, someone like Ibn Taymiyyah even says this long before Marx, that it is quite, it's in sociology and psychology that, your children are being abused. So you busy yourself with being the best PTA parent around. You become extremely active with taking care of the children who are outside your home and ignoring the children that need your protection the most. You are a person who know that you're a black person, and you know that your family and your people are the victims of endemic racism and suffering from violation of their civil rights day and night. And you make up for that by going into the field of music and becoming a Michael Jackson or a Prince. It's sort of, you're not helping your people at all. And in fact, you're distancing yourself from your people in every way, but it becomes, it makes you feel like you haven't betrayed anything because it gives you a sense of fulfillment. Well, look, as a black person, I'm succeeding, so that must count for something. And that's the danger in when you see your brethren being butchered and slaughtered right before your eyes. In a situation, if we lived in China, maybe I wouldn't have stopped, assuming that I could give something like al-hikam in China. But, in other words, if we lived in a country where you couldn't make any difference whether you put any pressure on politicians or not, it really wouldn't gonna make any difference. Then maybe I wouldn't stop it, because life needs to go on and Muslims need to persevere. But when you are in the United States, you are in the belly of the beast. There is no way that you can separate between your moral obligations and your existing in this country and being a citizen of this country. And that's why it's like those, who were sitting around, and Az bin Abdul Salam, the famous jurist of Egypt, who said, whoever goes and sees that Muslim countries, and he was talking in his day, he was talking about the fact that Muslim countries had suffered a number of crusades and so on, and says, and talks to people about the prohibition against fornication and adultery. He's betrayed God. In other words, there is a priority when Muslim lands, when Muslims are under slaughter. All of us must react as one body. I mean, and the thing that drives me insane is look at the other side. I mean, look at the way they act as one body, often even when it's wrong to do so, because they're on the wrong side of history. They're on the genocidal side. They are on the oppressive side. But still, they act with a solidarity, a usma. How often has the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran tried to instill in Muslims this sense of bond for one another, to the extent of saying that, if those who haven't joined in hijrah and become one, even destabilize their lives completely and become one, they several times in the Quran, Allah calls them sometimes hypocrites, sometimes calls them kuffar, for failing in their obligation of solidarity with fellow Muslims. And so, yeah, I think that has been, the oldest, and those who know the history of colonialism, and this is, we don't educate our children. Like, I can't imagine an Islamic school that doesn't give a rigorous course in colonialism, because Muslims of the modern age are a colonized people. No Muslims have escaped colonialism. That's just the reality. We Muslims would have liked to be a people who were not touched by colonialism. But the reality is, colonialism was A, built on a bedrock of racism, and B, built on a bedrock of Islamophobia. There was one civilization and one civilization only, that could have resisted colonialism, could have pushed colonialism back, and that's the Muslim civilization. And Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he knew fully well that this is where the danger to Europe came from, and this is where we must make sure. And Arnold Toynbee says it in his works. Those who want to read the works of Arnold Toynbee, be my guest, says it very openly. He says, the threat to Western supremacy of this world has always come from Muslims and will always come from Muslims. And that's why Samuel Huntington, professor at Harvard, wrote his Clash of Civilizations. And who does he focus on as the biggest threat? And I don't see it as a threat. I see it as a battle between the universal moral precepts of Islam, ethics of Islam, because true Islam would never, as a matter of consciousness, would never allow a genocide, would never allow a system of colonialism. Muslims occupied many parts of the globe. They never eradicated indigenous cultures the way that, people can point to a massacre here or a conflict here, but the systematic erasure of colonialism. Some people will say, well, that's maybe because Muslims who never had the supremacy in weapons. But so what? I mean, the point is that it's not part of the Muslim consciousness to internalize the type of supremacist racism that is the earmark of the rise of the Western civilization. And the way it dealt with the entire world, the entire globe as its toilet. I mean, literally the West, for the small part of Europe that for so many centuries was the most neglected part of the world. No civilization sprouted there. All civilization for centuries were in the Mesopotamia and the Nile region and Africa and so on, and China and India, and Europe was just, unheard of, unseen, of no interest. But when it became their turn to ascend, boy, they ascended with bitterness and vengeance. It's like we have been ignored by the world for centuries. Well, we're here now to tell you we will dominate you and we will act like we are superior to you, and we've always been superior to you, and we are genetically superior to you. And that is the disease of Western supremacy and Western racism. But anyway.
And that's shaitan.
Yeah, that's what is particularly sad when you find, especially where Christianity could have tempered the arrogance, and instead, especially Protestant Christianity, allowed itself to become the prey of the secular, capitalist, commercial interests so basically Christianity became the ideological trope of dominance. In the same way you see evangelical groups, Israel is committing a genocide, and you see outside evangelical churches, pray for Israel. Where is your morality? Where is the love of Jesus? Where is the tenderness of Jesus? Where is the beauty of Jesus in what you are doing to, no answer.
I mean, I think, the reality is that human beings will adopt and mold any belief system, whether it's religious or secular, to serve whatever they want to do. And Muslims do that with Islam. it's like this is uncomfortable and I want to forget. I don't want to think about this. I want to go back to sleep. And so you you utilize Islam to that ends, and these evangelical Christians utilize their religion to reach the conclusion that they want to arrive to. And one of the things that I just really hope, I I think when you made that comment that that the majority of the movements for Palestine right now are secular, it scared me and it worried me, and I really hope that people don't abandon Islam, because what I do see is that the most moral people, it's not under the banner of Muslims, and that I hope this is a message to those. If you are a religious authority, your silence is turning people away from God.
I want to just tell a lot of the Muslims that, do you know that part of decolonizing ourselves, when Europe colonized the Muslim world, all the principled opposition to colonialism, to subjugation, to oppression was Islamic. Part of us becoming colonized is that we have done exactly what Europe has taught us to do. Make religion the playground for theater, not real life, and reserve real life to the secular. That is part of our colonized self. So I really want to urge those intellectuals that, I know that Muslim spaces are frustrating because it is full of very ignorant people. I know that Muslim spaces are frustrating because it is full of very dumb people. People who are steeped in ignorance. But the Muslim intellect that wants to seriously decolonize must try to reclaim their ethical program, not to reclaim their ethical norms from within the Islamic tradition, and not abandon it to the stupids of our ummah. Because this is exactly what Emirati and Saudi and Islam has succeeded. I mean, it basically said Islam is just extracurricular. If you're a doctor, you do it in your
Yeah, I remember, I haven't seen this as much now because I think that this voice was pretty stamped out, and rightfully so. But early on, when this started a month ago or over a month ago, there were a lot of activist voices or pseudo-activist voices, social media voices talking about burnout, talking about how this is difficult, and then the other side of that, the opposition to that voice was, what right do you have to be burned out?
Yeah,
compared to the Palestinians. And I thought, because of experiences that I've had in my life, when there's burnout, I mean, a lot of people are saying the human is not created to see this much suffering, and I felt like everything was kind of, in my opinion, and this might be an unpopular opinion, everything was kind of missing the point, because I don't know where that comes from. The human being isn't meant to see this. No, I mean, really, I don't know where that came from, but also the truth is, nowadays we're just not, we don't even see the meat that we eat. We don't even see that animal killed.
Yeah.
It's something we're so not used to and so cushioned. But burnout, to me, comes from relying on self. And I feel like a huge part of why this is just from a psycho-spiritual, pragmatic lens, that when I think of the Sahaba and the early Muslims, and really any movement, even we're not going to talk about Islam, but you talk about the early Christians who were all martyred.
Yeah.
The torture and the things that they went through, that kind of human being versus the human being after 2 weeks of just not even it happening to them, but looking at it, saying the human mind is not meant for this. And then the other side saying, well, just tough it out. What's wrong with you? Think of what's happening to the other ones. And I'm like, you're really, I feel like this is missing the point, and it's an important point. That the human being who has built a relationship with God doesn't become burned out because they are connected to something that is infinite. And they are channeling something that is infinite. And I don't think that this battle, maybe I shouldn't use the word battle because I'm brown, and that's a very dangerous word for me to use. Sorry, this very non-violent this struggle. The struggle's even too hard. This squirming should really just is something that is better fought when not just when I'm attached to God and drawing from God, but it can't be won. It can't be done without God. And I think that it's the matter of faith is not me, because this has always been around. This has been around since before I was born, obviously. And this will probably be around for a long time. And I feel like people really do not know where to go. And so they're going to go to the most moral voices. And so when I said before that if you're a religious authority who's not talking about this, you're turning people away from Islam. It's because the Quran, and this is why I really hope that people will still keep going back to Project Illumine and listening to those halakas, because the Quran really does have the answer to this. And you might see secular voices acting out the things that the Quran is saying. And so I think I can imagine a lot of Muslims will say, well, why do I need the Quran anyway? I see this, but it needs to be both. It needs to have people that are, because I think when we freak out, when we start panicking, and even though our compass is oftentimes very correct, we abandon that source and we get scattered. And so, yeah. The other thing, and we'll wrap up because I think we've been going for a very long time. But this is, I told you it'd be 2 or 3 hours. He asked me how long this would be, and I said, 2 or 3 hours. I was joking. I was thinking an hour, but what you said was just very important on so many different levels. I think it needed to be said, even if people listen to this piece by piece, because this is like, that they tell you, like when you're going to school, even if no one else is asking questions and you think the question is stupid, ask it, because probably there's other people who are wondering the same thing. And that, when I was driving, the reason why I wanted to have this session was because that's what popped into my mind. I was like, well, I would feel kind of stupid asking this because I feel like I should know this stuff.
No.
But I think a lot of people don't.
They don't.
And there was an interesting thing, I will close with this, but there was an interesting opinion that I read that I wanted your opinion on, and then we can close, which is that you think the present ceasefire happened. Do you think it's a coincidence that the present ceasefire happened in tandem with Black Friday? That it's almost because people don't spend as much when a live genocide is happening. And I thought that was very interesting.
It would not surprise me. It would not surprise me because the one group that has bipartisan access to politicians and lawmakers, the Zionist lobby, they have access to Republicans and Democrats. And other than the Zionist lobby, merchants and bankers. When bankers can get meetings with Republican senators and with Democratic senators, heads of major corporations that affect, how the stock market is going to do, affect the economic indicators, and for very practical reasons. Someone like Genocide Joe, our president, knows very well that if the economic indicators on key economic events like this Black Friday show poor performance, that is, they know that's nearly a death knell for the elections. If the certain economic, Christmas season, and so it wouldn't surprise me if the economic people, the money people, the bankers, and said, listen, unless you want poor economic indicators for sales this Friday, because my experience in reading the history of the United States and in the real power in this country rests not with rich people, but with rich people who are willing to spend money. If you're just rich and your money is in the bank and that's it, like a lot of Arabs and Muslims, but if you are rich and you make campaign contributions, you grease the wheels of, you have access to, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and God knows whoever else. So yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Sadly, yeah.
Well,
It's a sad commentary in our world, but
yeah, I was gonna say Q&A, please.
Well, I had two questions, but I think you touched on one, which is to your point about Muslim leaders being silent, and what you were saying to me earlier today about how there isn't an Islamic intellectual voice, because most of the voices that are Muslim are actually secular or come from, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I don't know if you want to comment about that. And then secondly, the question about the world order, because I know there's this new thing, BRICS, right, that now has China and Russia and the new members of Saudi and Kuwait and all this. Like, is there any hope in that?
no, that's BS. And the reason it's BS is precisely because Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and these countries have not an iota of independence in their bone. These countries, if they get involved with BRICS, They are involved as proxies, as agents for Western powers. And China and Russia know that very well. And so, if China and Russia, and the reality is that China and Russia right now don't have sufficient overlapping interests, because China especially tends to see, because of its own history, tends to see the entire colonial world, which included Russia. I mean, Russia is just because of communism and other factors, but we forget that Russia was often a player in European history. So China tends to look at the entire world with a great deal of suspicion, including the Russians. And because of that, they have the hardest time coordinating between, I mean, if Chinese and Russian, if there was a Chinese-Russian alliance, like we see the alliance among European states, Western European states, it would be a formidable alliance. It would be a powerful alliance. But it doesn't exist. And the U.S. knows that, and the rest of Europe knows that, and they know that they will cooperate, they will help each other to an extent. And that became obvious when they saw China and Russia stand uselessly by as they invaded Iraq and spread military bases all over the Middle East. And even Russia couldn't stop the U.S. from even building military bases in Syria. I mean, Syria has been an ally of Russia forever. And Russia couldn't even stop the U.S. from intervening in Syria and pretty much having a free hand in Syria. So, Russia, for ethnic reasons, drew the line with Ukraine. And that's because Ukrainians and Russians have historically been very close. And there are, Russian-speaking Ukrainians that Russia does feel strongly about. And so, but that whole BRICS, and that when you look at the details, it's fluff. Nothing will come out of it. Absolutely nothing. People who want to see a more serious model was the model of non-aligned states in the 60s. A group of states that decided that they are neither going to ally themselves with the US or with Russia, with Soviet Union, and going to follow an independent policy. And they were very powerful and effective for a period of time until, it's a complicated story, but it fell apart. And unfortunately, but your first question about Muslim intellectuals, this is a very, you see, as I was told, Cherif, that when colonialism came in, all the systematic opposition to colonialism, the effective opposition, was Islamic. And the West, colonial powers, and including the U.S., knew that this is, and especially after the Iranian Revolution in 1970, they saw this as a can of worms. What they call political Islam, what was effectively principled, engaged Islam, that type of Islam that could overthrow a very close ally to the U.S., like the Shah of Iran. People forget people forget that Iran, the Iran that was controlled by the US, was the second nation in the world to recognize the state of Israel. So when Iran was under the control of the US, it was such a stooge that Iran and Israel were allies. And when they saw that who has the power to overthrow Iran was closer to the US than Saudi Arabia is to the US today. To see that it is the power of Islam that can do that, and that people like Ali Shariati, an intellectual like Ali Shariati, or an intellectual like Sayyid Qutb, or the various intellectuals of the 50s and 60s, Islamic intellectuals, that could inspire this type of grassroots. So they used the ugliest page in Islamic history to defeat that. And that is what colonialism has always done: divide and conquer. Use sectarianism. Use the Sunnah of Iraq against the Shia of Iran. Use the Sunnah of Iraq against the Shia of Iraq. Use the Sunnah of Saudi Arabia against the Shia of Iran, and turn the Iranian revolution from a revolution about Islamic liberation to a revolution about Shi'i power, by sending the message to Iran time and time and time again: you have no friends in the Sunni world. And that's exactly what happened. It took 1 million people killed in the Iran-Iraq war, but it's no skin off the US and Israel and the countries that funded the Iran-Iraq war. It took the entire complicity and duplicity and treason of the Saudis, and unfortunately also the Kuwaitis at the time, who funded the Iraq war against Iran. But part of what happened, this was the first scare. The second scare came in the Arab Spring, when they found that this was a different type of Islam. It wasn't an Islam like Wahhabi Islam. It wasn't about the hijab. It wasn't about the beard. It wasn't about men and women stood side by side in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia. And what was their chant? It was liberty, justice, and bread. And when it came time to prayer, all the Muslims who were screaming, not saying the Quran and Sunnah and so on, but liberty, justice, and bread. When it came time to pray, they would all line up and pray together. And then they would get up from prayer and chant again. And again, and this is one of the crimes of the Obama administration. It's the Obama administration listened to the advisors who said this is very dangerous. This is more dangerous than the Iranian Revolution. If Muslim countries work out a solution between democracy and Islam and can bring the two together, you will see a rebirth of Islamic intellectualism all over, because no one will be in the mood to listen to the Wahhabi Islam, to Emirati Islam, to stupid Islam, to ignorant Islam, to retarded Islam. Everyone is going to be interested, once again, in Ali Shariati, in Surush, in Al-Ghannouchi of Tunisia, and so on. And a decision was made. Israel, the Egyptian military, the Saudi government, the Emirati government, and the US came together and made a decision that must be defeated at any cost. And that's precisely what happened. And the moment that we're living in, the Hamza Yusuf Islam, the Zaytuna Islam, the Islam of the Sufis who pretend that they have nothing to do with Palestine. It is the Islam that was funded to defeat what they've labeled as Muslim Brotherhood Islam. And they knew that if they label it Muslim Brotherhood Islam, they factualized it. They made it not about Islamic ethics or principles. No, they made it about a political party. And so and they know very well that when they say, oh, you're a Muslim Brotherhood, they know that your first reaction is to say, well, wait, I've never had anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, if you actually know what you're talking about, there are so many disagreements about the differences between my thought and the thought of the Muslim Brotherhood. But that's not the point. The point is the same way they made the Iranian Revolution about Shia and Sunnah. They factualized, they divided and conquered. So they made this not about ethical Islam and unethical Islam. They made it about Ikhwani Islam versus Islam, mainstream Islam. So, and the thing is that people don't realize how many people are willing to convince themselves that it is no big deal if they accept money and just adjust their thinking a little bit and adjust their speech a little bit. I mean, it is like, okay, we'll just accept the money and we'll stop talking about Jerusalem. And very soon, it becomes not just an adaptation, but you actually start convincing yourself that what you've compromised was right all along. You start telling yourself, oh, I would have thought that even if they didn't pay me. But I am telling you, 20 years down the road, in the same way, when I said, remember when I was talking about Wahhabi Islam and how much Wahhabi Islam is funding, and I remember very well when I was among the very first to start saying that, and everyone was saying, oh, what are you talking about? Really? I am telling you, 20 years from now, when the lid is lifted and people realize how much of the Islam that you see today all over the West is bankrolled by American money, Israeli money, Saudi money, Emirati money. And then people will say, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, there's complete, because what happened also is that when Islamic spaces are full of people who are substandard in every way, people who don't have the best degrees, people who don't read the best books, people who, when you talk to, sound dumb. What do you think happens to talented and intelligent people? They say, oh, no, we don't want to be touched by that. And they go to secular spaces. But it takes real iman to refuse to abandon the space to the stupids and to keep insisting that no, you don't represent this tradition. I will not abdicate this tradition to you, because the price is the entire defeat and it's like, abdicating to colonialism. And that's what I'm telling You know, there are so many secular Muslims who are well-intentioned in condemning colonialism and saying we must decolonize. But what they don't realize is that it is impossible to decolonize as long as they continue abdicating Islamic spaces to the idiots and ignorance and morons and people of questionable ethics and questionable education. I mean, I would love to have very honest conversations about some people that I see in secular spaces about precisely these points. Because I often, for a lot of these people, I wonder what if their intellect was applied in Islamic spaces. They might have. Now, of course, part of the problem, like you take, one of the most often heard complaints, like Shabir Akhtar, is a good example, who didn't abandon the Islamic space, who didn't abdicate it, who remained in it, but felt completely ignored by Muslims. And that's the fault of how treasonous Muslim capital is. I used to say cowardly, now I say treasonous. Because Muslim money doesn't support serious Muslim intellectual activity. Far from it. In fact, the more serious they are, the more Muslim money is prone to betrayal. Anyway, I think I've spent myself. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
Great.
I will close it up by closing it up. Bye-bye,
Very
everybody.
eloquent. Bye-bye.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum salam.